Have you ever wished for better analytics and proper charts in Notion? And wouldn't it be amazing if your project management came with insightful statistics and breakdowns? Well, it's possible. In this video, I will walk you step by step through the process of turning your boring Notion setup into an amazing one. First, you learn the one trick you need to know to get charts into Notion. Then, I'll explain to you how to track 2 key metrics for project management. And last but not least, we will combine a few of Notion's most recent feature releases to help your team make better decisions when it comes to planning. So first up, how can you get charts in Notion? Until Notion introduces native charts, we'll need the help of a second tool. And one of the best ones for the job is Rows. Rows is a modern spreadsheet tool that integrates directly with Notion and is super easy to set up. Rows is very kindly sponsoring this video, and they have an amazing free plan, so you'll have no problem to follow along. All you need to do is head on over to Rows, link in the description, create an account, and then connect to your Notion. From there, you just need to import your data and you'll have your first chart ready to go. But how can you leverage this for better project management? Well, one of the most important things in project management is knowing how busy everyone is. And that can be quite tough in Notion to figure out, particularly if you need to track a lot of people. Luckily, this becomes much easier once you add a spreadsheet tool into the mix. Here I have some dummy data for a fictional company of mine called Notion that sells, Notion. And I want to see now at a glance who has how many tasks across which status level. I could do that in Notion. I could add a group, right? And I could then just try to guess visually or use these count fields, but it's not the most efficient way. In particular, if I have a lot of people and a lot of tasks, I will run into issues. So a better way is to leverage rows in order to do these analytics for us. Now, one quick remark before we start. I have it here as a text field set up for the responsible, just so I can have different people because I'm alone in this workspace, so I could not assign someone else through the person property. But in your setup, you would do the same with the person property and would probably work, or it will work just the same. All right, so let's have a look at how we can do this. In rows, we have something called data actions. And if you don't see this on the side, you can just click on data actions and then you can say import data from Notion. Now, you can then select import a Notion database. And if you then do it for the first time, it will ask you to connect Notion to Rows. So just follow that authentication process and you're good to go. After that, you need to then share the specific database with Rows. So in order for that, you want to go to the page where your database lives, right, the original instance. And then you want to click in the top right corner. Let's just move myself out of the way quickly. And the top right corner, the 3 dots, go down to add connection and then look here for Rows. Then click on that. We'll have access, continue, and confirm. All right. With that done, we can head back to Rows and then under database, click on select an option and pick the database that we want to pull in. Now, if yours doesn't show up here, quickly refresh the page and give it a second. Then we say build a table with all the data. And now we get all the information from our Notion database synced into Rows. We can then quickly tidy it up, right? So for example, we don't need a Notion URL part, so I'm just going to remove that. Oops. And then I want the name at the front, and then I can click on save all changes. Now, if your task database is very large in Notion, then I would definitely recommend to only import the properties that you need to work with, just to make it a bit easier when you, run all your calculations here now. So since it is now in a spreadsheet, we can do all the usual fun stuff, like most importantly, create a pivot table to figure out, okay, who has how many tasks. And don't worry, if you've never created a pivot table, I'm going to show you step by step. All you need to do is select all the values in your table and then go on insert and say pivot table. Now, one good practice to do is here, instead of having the actual numbers behind it, to actually remove them. So just say, okay, I want to get it from A to C, so all the values. And that way, even if, from the next sync in Notion, you have more tasks in here, it will still grab all the information. All right, then next step, we need to set it up. And here at the bottom, you see what we're currently building. So in Rows, what we want to select is the name of the person. Sorry, that was the task name. That was wrong. Let's remove that. We want to select the responsible person. And now we see, okay, Ivan, Jade, and Matthias. Then in the column, we want to have the status. So now we see done, in progress, not started. And then as the values, we want to have the status again as a count all. Now, one thing you see is here, it automatically sorts the way your fields are, alphabetically. So what you want to do is, in terms of the status columns, you want to say, okay, here in this case, Z to A, so that we have it in the correct order. But if you have other status and it doesn't work alphabetically, then you want to add like a number here in the rows table or in Notion, just to make sure that it displays in the right way. And perfect, there we have it. Now we have, at a glance, can see, okay, Ivan has 1 task not started, 3 in progress, and 2 done. And overall, he has 6 tasks. Now, this information should now, of course, live in Notion because we don't want to look at it in 2 places. And doing so is, again, super simple. All we need to do is click on the 3 dots here next to our table. We can actually first name this. So let's say workload per person. Click on the 3 dots and say, okay, please embed this. And here we need to quickly go over to the share settings and then share the the whole sheet, just like with Google Sheets. And then we can say, okay, copy the URL. And now with that, I can head back to Notion and say, okay, let's actually create 2 columns here and have my tasks for Notion marks on the one side. And then on the other side, I can embed my pivot table from rows and see at a glance again how many tasks every individual person has. Now, this information, and that's the great thing about rows, can automatically update. So if I say, like we have now more tasks in here, let's just select a few of them and duplicate them. Then I can head back over to rows and say, okay, please refresh this data source, refresh data source, and then it will pull in the remaining tasks. And my pivot table will automatically update and automatically also update in Notion to show the information. Now, you don't have to do that manually every single time. Instead, what you can do is you can click on your Notion database sync and say here on Edit Data Table, and then schedule a refresh. And that way, whenever like that refresh is due, it will pull in the new information and update all your embeds and connections in rows, which is super, super helpful to just have this up-to-date view of, okay, this is my pivot table, this is my analytics, and here is how much everyone in the company has on their plate right now. Now let's make these insights visual. So again, since we are in a spreadsheet tool and can easily create charts, we can now just take this pivot table and create a chart based off it. So what I will do is I'm going to take my rows here and I will say, okay, please insert a chart. And then I have a chart now here at the bottom, and then I can set it up. So I don't want a line chart. I want a stacked column chart. And in here, what we want to do is, now the screen is getting a bit small. I want to group the information by columns. That is already correctly set up, right? So I have Ivan, Jade, and Matthias. And I want to have the different status levels. And then I just want to adjust the colors a bit to have this look a bit nicer. So not started might be, this like light purple, in progress, the dark one. And then for done, we take the dark purple. Now I have this stacked column chart that shows me at a glance, well, okay, Ivan clearly has the most things on his plate from all of us, whereas Matthias, he can definitely do a few more things. He has 2 tasks not started, but he's also like, the lowest workload overall. And the process for embedding this into Notion is exactly the same. We click on 3 dots, we say embed, copy the URL, and we head back over to Notion and just paste it and say, okay, create embed. In here we have now our visual chart. Can resize it a bit according to what I need. Like this or like this. And now at a glance, oops, that was too small, see my information there. And of course, like the task name with the charts, that would also update automatically if I have it changed in rows. And then if any of this data changes, all the other information updates as well. Oh, and of course, if you don't want to build this all yourself from scratch, I have a template for you in the description link below. Next, you should set up an easy overview for your project progress. In order to do this, we first need to slightly expand our setup in Notion. I've created a separate database called projects, and now I want to link my tasks to my projects. And doing so is super simple. All we need to do is create a relation. So let's click on plus, pick the relation property here from the side. I'm gonna move myself again. And here say, okay, please relate this to the tasks database. And this, after I now toggle this on and say, okay, label one of the connections tasks and label the other one projects, allows me to select on each level the ones that should belong there, right? If I click in here, I see all the tasks, and I can pick an individual one, or the same here for the projects. And I can also bulk assign them by just highlighting a bunch of them and saying, okay, the project here should be the Q1 project, and then highlighting the remaining ones and saying, okay, all of these here, the project should be the new product launch. Perfect. With that connection established, I can now go on to my projects database and start counting the tasks per status. In order to do so, we will create a formula. Don't worry, again, with this formula, I'll show you step by step how it works. And there's also like a link to a blog post in the description where you can copy paste it from. So don't worry if you've never worked with formulas before. So this one, we will just call number of not started. And then I go into the formula and it will start with the name of my relation, which is tasks. And here I will then type dot and say filter, open the brackets. Then we click on current and say again a dot, and now take here the status. And what this does is basically, okay, it says go into the tasks relation and then filter certain items out. I only want to see the ones where the status equals, and now I type the exact name of my status, not started. Very important, this is case sensitive, right? So you need to make sure it really exactly matches the name of your tag, and then I can close this. Now if I do this, and just this, what I will see is then here I have now appearing all the tasks that qualify for that criteria, but it's not the number, right? It's only the actual task names. So I have to add one more thing to the property, to the formula. I type dot and length, and now what it will do is count actually the number of items, and I see, okay, I have 4 tasks that are not started and 1 in the other project. Now I can just repeat this for the other statuses. So I will just click here, right click this and say duplicate property. And then this one will be the number of in progress. And here again, say, okay, edit property, the formula. Now I just need to swap out this part, right? I just need to say here, okay, this should be capital I in progress, done. And here nothing is currently in progress. That can't be right. I think probably I misspelled something. Let's actually double check it. Edit property, in progress. Yeah, you see I have a large P, it is a small p, should be like this. So now it updates to 6 and 2. And then last but not least, I'm going to duplicate it again and say, okay, this one will here be now my number of done tasks. And again, edit property, change the formula, swap this one out for the thing done. Now you would of course do this for the properties that you have and the names there, but now you have this part in your database where you can at a glance see, okay, these are the number of my tasks per status level. And now I can go back to rows and create a chart for that. So let's import our new database to rows and click on data actions, Notion, and then import Notion database. This time we will select Notion Max, build a table with all the data. You know the drill by now. Now we have it here. We can quickly rename this to projects, and then we can modify the values. We don't need to see the URL. We don't need to see the tasks, right? And then we can just quickly reorder this to not started, in progress, and done. Perfect. And now we can just create individual charts for all of our projects. So you can say, okay, new product, please give me a chart. This time I want to have a pie chart, and I want to group the data by column, and I don't want to use the first row as a header. And now I have here for my project so this is my new product launch one. And again, can here just change the colors if I wanted. So the not started, medium one, and the dark one. And now I can go back and add this to my database. So embed, to my Notion part. So copy the URL, go to Notion, and then on my dashboard for the project, right, usually here I would have a database that shows me a linked view. It says, okay, okay, tasks, right, create a linked view of a database, pull in the task version, and then say filter this to only show the tasks linked to this project, right? That's how you would usually have your dashboard set up. And let's actually just open this as a full page. And here could then do the same thing as before, right? We add 2 columns and have on the one side then my actual tasks, and then on the other my my chart, hide the database title, expand this a little bit, just width wise, and see now, okay, at a glance, okay, here, this is the task that I have to do for this project, and this is how it currently stacks up in terms of performance. All right, so much for some key project management insights. Now let's take a look at how you can improve your decision making using burn charts. In case you don't know, burn charts are used to visually show how much progress you're making towards your goals. Having this visual indicator of progress over time will help you A, estimate how likely it is that you actually finish on time, and B, get better around decision making when it comes to allocating resources. And to build this, we need to get a bit creative and combine several of Notion's recent feature releases. The first thing we need to do is record the time when we finished a task. And this can actually be surprisingly difficult in Notion. Because of course, one thing we could do is to just create a new property, right? Call this our date, and then say, okay, this is the finish time. And then whenever we set something to done, we can click in here and say, okay, I've done this today. But no one has time for that, right? That's a super cumbersome workflow. So instead, we can use one of 2 workarounds thanks to some new feature updates. And the first one, and the best one in this case, is the automation one. Now, automations are only available if you're on a paid plan. So if you don't have that, you can use the second workaround, which also works super well. But other than that, I would recommend this one, because here all you can do is create new automation. And then we can label this record finish time. And then say, okay, when any of these occur, when the status of a task is set to done, then I want you to add an action and say here, please update the finish time and set the finish time to, depends on whether you actually want a timestamp right with a minute. I just care about a date in this case, set it to today. And then we can click on create. And now that means if I have another task where I set it to today, right? So for example, write video script. If this is done, you'll wait a second. And then after that, this will automatically populate thanks to the automation. There it is. The second method to do this is through the new database buttons. So you might have seen it. We have now buttons in our database. If you don't, there's a video link in the description for my favorite use cases. And these allow us to pretty much do the same thing. So we can just call this, finish task. That will be the name of the property. And then we can set a different label for this, right? So we can just call this done. And if you wanted, you could also add an emoji to it, right? Depending on what your overall style in Notion Workspace is. And then we say, okay, when this button is clicked, and then it works the exact same way as the automation. We say, okay, please set my status property to, first set the status property to complete, right? Because when we click it, we want to change the status. And then also we want to edit another property. We want to edit the finish date to fill the current date. And then you have that set up, and then we can just close it off. And now click on done here, and it will set it to done and adds the date, right? So here, again, you then need to change your behavior slightly, right? And say, okay, actually, now instead of changing the status manually, I will use this button to tick things off, but it's anyway very satisfactory to click them and saves you a click compared to having to click twice to change the status. So win-win on all ends, and you get to record the finish time at the same time. Next, let's set up a simple sprint database. Now, of course, you can also do this on your project itself, but traditionally these burn up or burn down charts are used with sprints. So that's what we're going to do here. So we created just have a new database here. And now again, just like with the projects, we relate that to our tasks. So let's pick our task Notion Max, show it on both sides. These are the tasks. And the other item will be our sprints. Sprint like this. And then assign a bunch of tasks to different sprints. So just grabbing these here, and all of those will be part of sprint 1. So we go in here, says sprint 1, and then all of the remainders will be part of sprint 2. And with that setup, once we have our separate sprint database, and oops, that did not go, sprint and number 2. Once we have our setup here, we can then just go, okay, quickly, let's wrap this so we don't see all of them, and now set a duration for the date range. And now it depends a bit on what your typical progress is on where you want to track it, right? Do you want to track this over the month? Do you want to track this on a quarterly basis? Here for these sprints, let's actually assume that we do this on a week-by-week basis. So sprint duration, and here we'll then say, okay, this sprint 1 will go from the 5th, actually that goes from the 31st to the 7th, and the sprint 2 will go from the 3rd to the 10th, something like that. All right, with these two things set up, we can now write a Notion formula that helps us automatically identify how many tasks were done on which date of the sprint. That formula can seem a bit intimidating, but we're going through it step by step, so you should have no problem replicating it. So let's start by creating that actual formula property. And we'll need to have several formula properties per instance that we want to track. So in this case, right, we want to track this based on the different days on our 7-day sprint window. So we just label the first one day 0. Now, what we need to do is first figure out, okay, which of the connected tasks were done on that date. And the formula for that would be that we take, okay, tasks dot filter. You know that already, right? We need to filter for certain items. And now here we need to say, please take from the current value the finish date. And then let's actually turn that into the timestamp for better comparison. Now here it becomes relevant whether you fill the current time or the current day. That's why I recommend filling the day, because if you fill in the current time, then comparing it to a specific day becomes a bit more complicated. So that's why we should go with a more generic thing up there. So that's the first part of it, right? So let's filter it out where we say our current finish date, the timestamp, and then what should that equal? That should be equal to the current date. So for that, we need to take the the date start part of our range, because right, there are 2 dates in there. So we want to get the first one from the sprint duration. And here again, like just turn that into a timestamp. And then we can close all of that off. And now what we should see here is all the ones that were done on the first day, on the 31st, which currently is none, right? So let's go actually back up there and say, okay, actually the first task that was done on the 31st, and now that should appear, right? Perfect. So this part of the formula works. We can now check whether this was done on day 0. Now, we're not quite done yet because we need to modify this part. First, in order so we can use it on the subsequent days, we need to make sure that it's not just equal, but it's equal or smaller, right? Equal or before that date. And that way we can then make sure that also like as we go through it, right, we then still have things in there, not just the ones that were on that specific day. For example, right, let's assume like doesn't match now with our sprint date range anymore, but let's assume we had like a task done on the 30th of Jan. We also want to see this in here, right? Both of them should then count for the next day to just see like how many of them were done. All right, so that's a good start, but we're not, again, done yet. The next thing that we now need to do is we need to check, we need to actually would grab the length from this, right? So we just do dot length, and now we see, okay, how many tasks were actually done up until that day. All right, that looks pretty good now. And now what we can do is to just add one last thing so that we can, switch that start date around, right? So because for the subsequent days, we need to say like, okay, +1, +2, +3. Or if you track in like different, times of, in different intervals, you would need to adapt it accordingly. So we go back in here and say where it says date start. After we have this date, we actually want to add something to this date. So before we turn this into a date start, into a timestamp, we will say dot date add. And now in here, we want to add to the sprint duration 1 and days, right? The first element indicates how much we want to add to it, and the second, how many elements we want to add to it. And just to, and actually let's have this at 0 for now for the first one. And just to show you what this formula only does, right? Let's take date start and let's just take that element, click on done, and quickly create like a separate formula as an example, just so you can follow what this formula actually does. Is here we say, okay, please take the sprint date and add 0 to it, right? But if I now say, please add 1 to it, it goes up to the first, and so on and so on. So that means we can then dynamically in these values, no matter where your sprint start is, then say, okay, please check whether this was, like 1 day after the start, 2 days after the start, 3 days, 4, and so on. We're not completely done yet though, because the disadvantage or like the problem right now is that we get like the absolute numbers of tasks, which is helpful. But if we want to see like a relative comparison, right? Okay, like what is our percentage of the progress on these days? Then we will need to add a bit more elements to our formulas. So we need to take this whole thing that we have here and we need to divide it. And we need to divide it by the total number of tasks, right? So we need to again go back to tasks and say, okay, divide it by the tasks dot divided by tasks, and then the length of the task, so tasks dot length. So now we get the relative value, and now in order to turn this into like a nicely rounded percent value, we first need to actually multiply it with, depending on how many values you want to see. Let's say actually we divide it and multiply it with 1000. Then we round it, and then we divide it by 1000. And we need to do that because the round operator will always round it to the nearest like full number, right? So if you just round 0.15, it will just round it to 0. So by multiplying it with 1000, we get now to like this value that has like 3 things here. And then we can say, okay, number format should actually be percent. Now we see, okay, on day 0, we managed to complete 15.4% of the progress. Now, once you're at this point with this fairly long formula, again, you can also copy paste it from the blog post in the description. You can just take this, copy it, and like
create duplicates, or like just right click and duplicate it for however many steps you want. So let's say we want like 7 steps, right? We saw, okay, we have then day 0 and now we have day 1. And here we will go in and say, okay, formula. And all you need to do is swap out now the 0 to the 1, right? That's why we made the first formula a bit more complicated so that we can now quickly duplicate this. So, okay, let's do a few of the days. Day 2, again, add the formula, move it to 2. All right, just did the remaining ones off screen, so we're a bit faster. But now you see the magic of this formula come in. We now really have for each day of our sprint duration, how many tasks we actually have finished, and it keeps counting up, right? This is otherwise not possible in Notion because you can never get a snapshot over time. And again, it auto updates, right? For like your other sprints, you just put in a corresponding sprint duration and will automatically work, right? So we see here, if we take now any of these tasks, and said, okay, we finished that on February 9th, right? On one of the last days, you see, okay, up until day 5, we had 28%, and then we have our uptick to 42 and 42. So once it is set up, this is automatic and don't have to ever touch it again. And by now, you know the drill. How do we get this as a chart into our Notion? Well, we first head on over to rows and then click on data actions, Notion, import a database, and this time take our Notion sprints, build a table with the data, get it down here in the bottom in a second, clean it up for a moment. So we will quickly remove the sprint duration, start and end. We don't want in here. We actually only care about the days. We can grab the name if we want, and not the tasks, and then quickly just reorder it. So we have, okay, day 0, day 2, 1, day 2, sometimes a bit confusing by what order it automatically pulls it in. All right, here we go. Save our changes, and then we can go in here and highlight the row for the chart and values where we want to create our chart. And this time would be a line chart, right? And say, okay, please here don't use this as the values. And now we have here our burn-up chart that shows us how we progress. And of course, we could also select instead like all our sprints, right? If we want to have a comparison against them and see, okay, how do we actually progress in comparison against them? And then we can, again, just click here, say embed, grab the URL to go back to Notion and do our usual game of, if we want to see it side by side, creating 2 columns and then taking the Notion database in one and our rows chart in the other one. And then again, once something updates in our values and we have the refresh scheduled, the chart will also automatically update.
Now you're ready to really level up your Notion workspace with detailed stats. But don't just stop there. There's one more trick that Notion experts use to build really insightful workspaces. And if you want to become a true Notion master, you definitely need to know about it. Just click here and I'll see you in a second.